Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Vicky Bowman, a senior advisor at Institute for Human Rights and Business, and we're going to have a short panel before lunch, before coffee. I need coffee. On migrant workers in conflict-affected countries, and it'll be myself and Rakesh, who you heard earlier on this morning, who I hope is out there somewhere. Rakesh, are you there? And Vincent Bernard, who is from ICOCA, and he'll explain a little bit what ICOCA is for those of you who haven't come across it before. So we're going to address this topic from a couple of angles. The angle of workers going to work in conflict-affected countries in commercial supply chains, so in the private sector, whether it be in construction or manufacturing or agriculture. But then we're going to do a deeper dive into those who are going to go and work in the private security sector. And so obviously in that area, it's as much around clients who are governments and aid agencies and non-private sector actors as it is the private sector, but they are still migrant workers and they're being affected in similar ways and treated in similar ways within that supply chain of private security. If we could, or can I move it to the next slide, or the first slide? How do I do that? Take control, audio visual. Okay, there we go. So just to say that we're going to be mainly looking at Rakesh's observations of what he's seeing of migrant workers travelling from South Asia to the Middle East and to Russia, Ukraine. But I also want to just flag up that tomorrow we have a session which will include my colleague Thithi Thane talking about migrant workers moving from conflict-affected areas from Myanmar. And that's already come up several times in the course of today as being a very significant source of migrant workers within Southeast Asian supply chains and beyond there in Gulf, in Northeast Asia as well. So Rakesh, turning to you, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're observing in terms of trends for migration corridors to conflict-affected areas? What's motivating people to go and where are they going?
Thanks, Vicky. Hello, everyone. Greetings from New Delhi. Am I audible?
Yeah, you keep talking, slowly but surely.
So I'm really sorry about this world map, because I can see arrows have moved from here and there. So basically what we wanted to show here, wanted to show origin and destination regions basically. So if you can see, Myanmar's arrow has moved. So Myanmar to Thailand and also to Bangladesh because of recent refugee crisis. And then also we intended to show the workers from India and Nepal are moving to Russia, Ukraine, and also Israel, Palestine. And then within Middle East also we have number of movements around. So these are some of the
Rakesh, just before you keep talking, could I get you to speak a bit closer to the microphone, because at this end you're quite soft, but if we turn your volume up at this end we'll get a lot of feedback. So can you speak a bit closer to the mic, perhaps?
Just give me a second, sorry.
Sorry about that, you're very soft.
Is it better now?
Moderately.
Moderately.
Okay, anyway, speak clearly and as loud as you can. Over to you, sorry.
Sorry, I hope this is better now. So very quickly, with this slide, we are very sorry because the arrows have moved a bit, but hello?
Yeah, keep going.
So arrows have moved a bit. So basically we wanted to show origin and destination regions basically. So Myanmar workers are from Myanmar are moving to Thailand and Thailand and Bangladesh because of recent refugee crisis. Then India and Nepal workers are going to Russia, Ukraine, and also Israel, Palestine. Then also within Middle East we also see some movement. So these are some of the examples. These are not exhaustive. We have not included everyone because otherwise the arrow will become, it will be difficult for us to see all the movements. Very quickly, because we have very less time, I just wanted to emphasize here, and this, I don't want to become philosophical, but still, let's start with little philosophy, where I like, we have to understand migration is reality of our time. This is a quite layman, quite generalized statement about migration, but the reality is we have to also move beyond push and pull factors. And this is where I am trying to emphasize here today. Whether it is push or pull, vulnerability has become intrinsic feature of migration. Workers are vulnerable, and most of the times we move beyond workers, and we always consider geographies when we talk about movement. But workers are there. Workers are vulnerable, and there are a number of issues they face. When they move, they go to conflict affected countries because of number of reasons. So what we did, we have listed some of the regions. We tried to include as many as possible, but there may be many other regions also. So some of the regions which we have listed here, and we have to also consider in the origin countries, most of these origin countries which we have highlighted in the map, one thing is very common, which is economy, like income. Income, in the sense, most of these workers lacks employment opportunity in the like at the homeland. Most of the times, workers do not have proper employment, and that also force them to move. And at the end, income is important. And if I you quickly, if I can show this advertisement where you can see. Uh, Wage is almost 10 times high than what they can get in India, for example, in India or in South Asia. So I'll just give one example. If workers in India can receive $200 a month, if they are lucky to get a job, but in Israel, the advertisement says if they can get up to 2000, they can get at least 2000 US dollars monthly salary. And this is huge. This is 10 times. And this is the one of the very important region where safety is becoming less important. Now bring your I'll ask you to read these quotations on the screen, and these are very important. And one of the workers said, work risks are everywhere, and we need to take them." So there's like uh, how important risk is. The question remains like, where is safety? Are they safe in India? Are they safe in Bangladesh? And then why not to go somewhere where like safety has become secondary and income become primary, and that's income is very much connected with vulnerability. That vulnerability is everywhere within in the origin as well as destination. So that's like one of the very important issue we need to understand why workers are moving to these conflict affected countries. And then this another thing which I'll mention here.
Brilliant. Maybe we'll move on to the next slide where we're covering a bit the challenges that they're facing in conflict zones. And if you could move quickly through that, but try and speak up
Yes.
as loudly as possible because the acoustics for some reason are not very good.
I'm really very sorry. So very quickly, if I can broadly just go to the headlines. Uh, Security and risk. Most of these workers are going to work in the conflict zone. So risks are inherent, like they have to face the risk. And most of the time, workers are being restrained. So there are examples where were refused to leave. So workers were not allowed to leave the war zones. And most of the times, if they asked to relocate, they were either deported or they were not allowed. We have examples of Nepali workers from Russia, Ukraine, they were not allowed to move. And also many Thai or Yemen workers in Palestine, Israel conflict, where they were not allowed to move. Uh, Most of there are also incidents where workers were forced to work very close to danger zone or war zone. That also we have seen, and many people have died also. So one Indian worker went with the recent recruitment, and he died because he was working in very close to war zone. That is also very important. Another one very important I would like to highlight here is all these migration, all these recruitments are basically happening because they are replacement. So they are replacing Palestinian workers. Now we have to also understand how much time they can spend there. If the war become, if these two fighting countries will have normality, or they will become little, their relationship will become little better. Isn't it like they will be again recruiting the old regular usual workers? Then these new workers who are like dreaming for their higher better income will have to suffer. So that is also we have to understand. And then again, one very important issue which I want to highlight here, government's role. So there's a huge confusion in India, especially going on about whether this is government to government relationship or government to businesses or business to government or sector to business or business to sector. So because there are quite confusing statements from government officials in India where they are saying, we are not managing. We have just signed one agreement. Most of these recruitments are being run by business directly. So that is also problematic, because if there is a confusion, if there is a problem in these destination countries, who will do the evacuation? How these migrant workers will be saved? That is also a very important problem. So since we don't have time, very quickly to next slide. So some of the things, and I request Vicky to also add her input here. So we have to also understand in the very second session today, we heard about role of workers. We need to have worker-centric policies. So this should not be just about government to government or business to business, but role of migrant workers should be centric. Their voice and their issues should be addressed by these policies. And then again, authorities, those who are managing all these events, should also ensure workers should receive regular information and inputs. And then protection from exploitation is important, because most of the time, which I have mentioned just now, there's no option for relocate, or the workers are not being allowed to move from danger zone to safe zone. So protection against exploitation is required. Role of business is very important there also. And sorry, am I audible? Sorry, the screen is not moving. So, and then just before I finish, and we have number of issues we can discuss here. But just before I finish, I'd like
for workers, particularly workers who are sort of exposed to the conflict zone, I think is quite significant, and particularly when they're in the private security function. So I think let's move over to Vincent to talk a bit around migrant workers in the private security space. Thank you, Rakesh. I'm sorry about the audibility to the audience.
Thank you, Vicky. Thanks to the organizers. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a very rich topic, so I hope it's just an introduction, and we should continue this conversation because we have only a limited time to discuss it. And Vicky asked me to introduce the topic of migrant security workers in conflict, more specifically. Before that, she also asked me to present briefly my organization, which is called the International Code of Conduct Association. So some of you probably remember the war in Iraq and the Blackwater incidents, the Nisour Square massacre, where a private military company killed Iraqi civilians on a square in Baghdad. That was at the time the start of a reflection on the governance and regulation of the growing private security and military industry. This industry keeps growing, it's still on, and it's still involved in conflict situations. So at the time there was a need to involve companies in this governance and to create a code to which companies could adhere to. Not only governments, but the companies themselves. And so this code was created in 2010, and a multi-stakeholder initiative composed of governments, companies, civil society was created a few years later to operationalize human rights and the laws of war to private security companies. So ICOCA, or this association, is probably the only organization which has an operational dialogue with the private security industry in the field on their respect for legal obligations. And we translate these legal obligations into guidance, codes, trainings. We help companies reach those standards, and then we certify those companies and then monitor how they implement the codes. So for clients which contract private security companies, basically all companies are today, or virtually a vast majority of companies are dealing with private security in a way or another. So for clients of private security companies, we are a risk reduction mechanism because we make sure that those private security companies uphold international standards when it comes to human rights. And it's not only about the relations with the public, it's also about the way they treat their own staff. Because we think that actually poorly treated people will tend to treat others poorly. And we are talking about workers which have access to weapons, resources, which can engage into corruption. So it's critical to make sure that they respect human rights. So just briefly, we touch upon this question of migrant workers, but the issue of migration and private security is much broader. We see working conditions issues also in countries at peace. For instance, with the FIFA World Cup, the condition of the guards working in Qatar came up in the media, and we see that in most countries, the private security industry is really employing, let's say, the lowest category of people in the formal economy, with the cleaning sector. So we have lots of issues also outside of conflicts. We see also private security companies managing migration. And some countries are hiring private security companies to manage migrant detention camps. For instance, in the UK, you had this scandal about the Brookhouse Immigration Detention Center, and we've seen a series of scandals whenever private security has been involved in the management of migration camps and detention facilities. We see private security actually causing migration. We see rogue actors operating in Africa, in other parts of the world, which actually attack civilian population and creates displacement of population. So that's another dimension for the human rights lawyers in the room to consider. And finally, we see private security in conflicts, and we see actually this model of hiring private military contractors to wage war abroad being now a model that other states than the US are applying. So Ukraine has been recruiting, the Wagner Group has been recruiting Nepalese who are going to fight in Ukraine. We've seen movements after a conflict when there is a demobilization, former rebels, former combatants are on the mercenary market and travel from one country to another. Okay, so this is still ongoing, and we still see migrant workers being hired on US bases, for instance, in the Gulf region, where they guard facilities. Today we see, for instance, also lots of Ugandans working in Somalia as private security guards around the perimeter of the airports in Mogadishu. So this is still ongoing. It was not only in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it's a model which is now applied in different ways by different countries. However, we should not mix and confuse mercenaries, people who are hired to participate in offensive operations, with private security guards who operate in conflict, who are the vast majority. So I won't speak so much about the mercenaries, okay? First, because it's a category which is prohibited under international law. And here we see specific problems with mercenaries who are often actually highly qualified, highly paid sometimes, not always, but there is a market there. Here we are going to focus on the vast majority of the security workers who are commonly called as third country nationals, the TCN, who were hired or who are still hired to be private security guards in multinational operations, in conflict zone to secure businesses or diplomatic missions. So that's the majority of the guards. Here you see some indicators of their numbers during the war in Afghanistan. In Iraq, you had similar numbers or even more. Actually, the same proportion as soldiers, and sometimes twice, 3 times as many as soldiers were private military contractors. And of course, you had also local contractors. So we see a system which has a kind of racialized setup to provide security around a multinational operation or a military perimeter. They provide escorts, intelligence, logistics, training, advice, maritime security, for instance, against piracy. Nowadays, they are also very much involved in demining in Ukraine, for instance. They are involved in humanitarian demining. They are contracted by the United Nations, for instance, to do this kind of job. They are hired by all types of actors, and more they are also hired by humanitarian organizations, which used to rely on acceptance and now more and more contract private security companies. They fill the gap for armies. They are considered as mostly more cost efficient than running a large military setup. But they're also lowering the political cost. States are reluctant to use conscription, perhaps since the Vietnam War. Even Russia has been reluctant to use conscription. And they recruit in foreign countries private security guards who actually, when they die, don't bring the political cost that your own nationals, that the death of your own nationals bring. So there is this element of political opportunity in hiring these workers. So we see different nationalities which have a reputation as guards. For instance, the famous Gurkhas in Nepal. So it has created a kind of recruitment road from Nepal that Rakesh mentioned. But we see other nationalities being commonly recruited as security guards. And as I said, it creates a kind of racialized system. If you imagine the perimeter of a base in Afghanistan, you would have local Afghan guards at the gates. You would have Nepalese and other nationalities actually in the inside perimeter or on the fence, and inside you would have Westerners, foreign, former special forces, elite forces, who are actually giving the orders and instructions. Now, there are many examples, many incidents. You'll find many in the news. Here you've got an advertisement to recruit guards in Uganda for Somalia. We had the case of Nepalese guards being caught in this evacuation. Some Nepalese guards forgotten there, being stuck in an hotel, who had been recruited to serve as private security but were left behind. So we had one of our member company coming to the rescue and trying to bring them back home. Many of those guards actually were brought straight to the conflict zone without having their passport stamped, so they could not actually simply go back to the airport. They would have been arrested on the way. They had no visa, no ground to be there. We see, for instance, indeed, that some of those guards actually died. Some were recruited as security guards, but were involved in suicide attacks, for instance. They were directly targeted. Some also took part in operations which involve violence. Most recently, we had the case of Sudanese men hired as shopping mall security guards, but tricked into fighting for Libya in the Libya civil war. So that's another case. But there are many, many such cases. If you're interested, you could read that book called Under Contract, which describes the journey of the Nepalese and other nationalities into this Afghan war. I interviewed Noah Coburn, and he said it's like the Roman Empire when they used to, bring tribes from beyond the walls to guard their borders, recruiting the barbarians into their own security perimeter. So he made this analogy, which I find quite telling. So what do they experiment? And we've been discussing a lot about the problem, so I won't repeat what others have said. It looks like many of the problems you've identified in other sectors. We are talking about absence of vetting. For instance, Nepalese could be recruited simply on the basis of their physical abilities. We don't know what is their past or their track record. We see the problem of debt bondage, confiscation of passports, disparity between promises and reality. We had a few cases of people being recruited as guards for shopping malls, but ending up in a war zone. Of course, poor accommodation. Maybe they are protecting the base during the day, but in the evening they take a bus and they go to a non-protected area where they sleep. And we are more exposed. So issues like this that you experiment, of course, in a conflict zone. And when injured or when there are casualties, they are not compensated to the same level as expatriates are. And so they are often sent back with a certain amount of money, when actually they could have claimed much more, or they could have been treated in a proper, good hospital, but they are just sent back by the companies which get rid of them. So many, many problems. Here I share with you this graph from our global survey. If you are interested, there are a few copies outside. I won't bring them back to Geneva, please. We had a global survey on working conditions, and we identified, or guards identified in the survey that that in this sector where there is quite a lot of discrimination, the first cause of discrimination is nationality and ethnic background. So we definitely need to go deeper and study more this question of discrimination within the private security industry. So a few recommendations to conclude. If companies operate in a high-risk environment, there is no choice, they will hire private security companies. And they are doing it. And in those markets, it's largely an unregulated sector, which benefits from the chaos and from the situation of poor governance. So private security is a risk. It's the paradox of security. Because of their situation, they can access to weapons and risks of abuse are high. And migrant workers are particularly exposed in those situations. But the companies and clients are also very much exposed. And we even had to have this kind of dialogue with the humanitarian organizations which don't realize the type of problems that they could face. So there is a huge risk of reputational damage for clients. And actually, we would like to, and I think thank you for the opportunity, to recommend that clients of private security providers look at our procurement guide. So is a link there. And we recommend also that they hire ICOCA certified companies because we do the due diligence and make sure that those companies actually respect human rights. I've also mentioned the private security industry tool set, which was produced by Verité, which is extremely detailed on the question of forced labor. So it's another resource you could use. And finally, we have other resources on the ICOCA website, including this research on working conditions in private security, so have a look. And also a list of incidents involving private security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Bonnie, do we have one good question or not? Any questions?
We do. All right. Hi, Vicky.
Hi, Bonnie.
So, we have a great question about what about areas of high human insecurity? By that, it hasn't reached the threshold that we use for conflict, but areas of high criminality. And then there's another question. Thinking about migrant workers who are acting in a private security world, do you know how they affect things like when you conduct worker interviews? Does that have a deterrent effect, positive effect in facilitating, coming to that element of trust that is so needed to do meaningful worker interviews?
Okay, two great questions for Vincent. And then we have coffee. Okay,
so quickly. On the first point, the code applies to complex environments. It's not limited to conflict situations. So complex environments and instances where you could face higher human rights risks. So it's not limited to conflict situation. Of course, you need less the code in, let's say, a country which has a very strong governance of the private security industry. But still we see that there are issues related specifically, for instance, to detention of migrants, for instance. Even in a country like the UK or even in Switzerland, we have had issues with private security and violations of human rights. So I would say that there are certain types of environments which require heightened human rights due diligence when it comes to private security. And there are certain indicators that you could face certain problems in some countries. Like, for instance, in some countries, they are allowed to use firearms, not in others. In some countries, we see them involved in detention, not in others. So we will identify certain risks according to different countries. But across the board, we see that their working conditions are poor. And in our survey, 40% of the guards said, in the different countries we're running this survey because we are doing now country research, 40% on average say that actually their poor working conditions lead guards to commit abuses. So it's a cause, it's an explanation of many of the human rights abuses we see in the sector. And I think it's interesting to work on this relation and talk to clients about the risk of contracting private security when the working conditions are so bad that people have no choice but to engage into corruption or other types of practices.
And the question about interviewing guards, doing due diligence in those situations, are there any differences to doing interviews in normal situations?
Recruitment of guards in conflict?
Not necessarily, but more around interviewing around their working conditions, or at least finding out from them what the conditions are that they're facing.
Yeah, it's more difficult, of course, you mean an interview for the research, I suppose. It's more difficult in a conflict situation because there is lots of secrecy among the industry. We have members working in private security companies which are members of ICOCA, which work in conflict, and which share with us the incidents they see around them, and which try to make a difference. For instance, this company which rescued those Nepalese private security guards who were lost in Afghanistan, they tell us, about the conditions of others. For us, it's difficult to run interviews across the sector in conflict zones, simply because it would expose the guards and possibly our own team to some retaliation. But when we do monitoring missions, we have like those confidential dialogues with our members, with our partners, in order to get an overview of the situation in the country and identify also malign actors. Because private security is important in conflict area because it ensures continuity. It protects the civilian population. It protects the business. It allows for people to have jobs. So we need private security in those situations, but we need also to have a clear distinction between malign actors and actors operating according to human rights.
Good.
Thank you.
I think that was very interesting, and I think opens up further discussions that we can't get into here around the importance of this industry, because it's 20 million plus people are employed in private security, so it's a huge employer globally. So thank you very much, Rakesh, online, for doing your best. And thank you, Vincent.
Thanks.